Hey guys, I'm Sal. Thanks for checking out the video. Today we're going to be installing some Bilstein 4600 shocks on my 2002 Tundra. The suspension on this truck is completely shot. It's well overdue for a refresh. The bushings are completely gone and it doesn't drive super well, so it's something I've been wanting to do for a little bit now. I am well aware that Bilstein makes a 5100 series shock for these trucks and they're a super popular upgrade, but I plan on making a whole video dedicated to my thought process for why I went with these, but the short of it is these just fit my use case. I don't do any off-roading, and these are going to be perfectly fine for what I do as a daily driver. So with that said, the installation process is going to be identical between this, the 5100s, any other options that you decide to go with. So with that, let's get into it. Okay, so I knocked out the passenger side first, and you can see here just how blown out those lower shock bushings are. The shocks weren't leaky at all, but those bushings were just completely toast. After that side, I slid the truck over. It's a little tight doing this kind of work in a single car garage, but if you set it at an angle like this, you actually have a decent amount of room to work, more than you might expect. On the driver's side, the shocks weren't leaking any fluid either, but these bushings look just as bad, if not worse, than the other side, and it certainly explains the harsh ride that I was feeling over any bumps or even just small cracks and potholes in the road. I mean, I was basically just driving around on solid mounted suspension, you know, race car stuff. Okay, cool. So just finished up the passenger side front. Coming over here to the driver's side, got my little zone set up. The passenger side took me about 3 hours to do, but it's one of those deals where I had to figure out how to use the spring compressor, which took longer than I'd like to admit. I troubleshot something for like 30 minutes before I figured out like a really pretty simple solution for it. So I bet you this side will go a lot smoother. But yeah, we're all set up, so we'll start by pulling out the spring. Okay, so I'm going to start with taking off this bottom nut here. It's a 19 millimeter. Next, I'm going to disconnect the sway bar end link to give us a little bit more travel with the suspension to be able to get this out a little bit easier. It's a 14 millimeter. Okay guys, so this is the same issue I was running into on the other side where I'm pulling down on this pry bar, but the lower control arm can't go any lower because we're actually running into a clearance issue up here with the upper ball joint hitting the spring. So you could just use a punch and punch the bolt all the way through, but I did that on the other side and it kind of screwed up the threads a little bit, so I'm reluctant to do that over here as well. So what I ended up doing on the other side to put it all back together was actually disconnecting the loosening, I suppose, the 4 bolts for the lower ball joint and just letting this whole lower control arm sag down a little bit. So if I do it now, then I can knock the bolt out loosely, and then I'll just put it all back together on the back end. So these are 14 millimeter sockets, and definitely double check your wrench is loosening because it's a little disorienting doing this upside down, but the first time I did it, I was actually tightening and I broke one of the bolts, so felt like kind of an idiot. So on the passenger side, the bolt actually came in through the front, whereas on this side, it's passed in through the back. So when I'm trying to poke it out, it's actually hitting the axle there. So what I'm going to end up doing is just taking off the other 2 bolts for the lower ball joint. That way I can press this lower control arm all the way down and poke that bolt out. There we go. Now you can see all the movement you get having that lower ball joint disconnected. So with the big bottom bolt out, now we can disconnect it from up top here. The stock configuration would be studs coming through with nuts on top, but because I have this aftermarket leveling spacer on here, the studs are actually recessed in here, and then there's bolts coming in through the top, so yours might look a little bit different. Okay, so I got the strut assembly out, took the leveling spacer off, and can we just take a second to appreciate this bushing, or lack thereof, I guess. It makes sense why the ride sucked so bad. So this is one of the things that took me way too long to figure out on the passenger side, and I was just trying to use the spring compressor like this to slide in between the springs, and I'm like, this is so dumb, it doesn't even fit. And I actually gave up and wouldn't recommend this, but I ended up just blasting off this top nut with everything under tension, and things moved a little bit. It's definitely not recommended. But what you're actually supposed to do, I figured this out when I was putting it all back together, you just take this threaded rod out from the middle, and then you can slide these in like this. In between, it's still a tight fit, but you can slide these in between, and then you put the rod back through them again, and then you can tighten it down. So one thing I forgot to mention is you want to make note of the orientation of the top hat to the bottom mount before you take the spring completely off, because once this all comes apart, when you put it onto the new shock, you want to make sure that the studs are oriented properly, so when you install it back into the truck, everything lines up. I didn't really do that super well on the passenger side, and I had to recompress the spring and kind of pivot this in order to get all the studs to line up. So yeah, just make note of that before you take the spring completely off. So following Bilstein's instructions, we'll put this washer facing up. Then underneath that, or abutting that, I guess, will be the bottom of the top hat. And you should have your OEM bushing in here. And if it's in good condition, you can leave it. Bilstein just says to reuse the OEM one. So, yep, this will sit on here. And then I'm kind of an idiot because I took the spring compressors off, but I got to put them back on in order to get the spring onto here. So I don't really know what I was thinking, but yep, we'll get the spring recompressed and thrown onto the shock. Ease it down and then line up the bottom right there, in like the seat down there. You can kind of see it right there. You can throw this guy on, and tons of thread to get our nut on. Now this is when you want to pay attention to the orientation before you tighten this nut and release the spring. So see, we can still move it right now. So I'm going to reference my pictures and get this oriented, and then we'll tighten down this top nut. Next I'm going to tighten down this top nut, but you can see if I spin it, the whole thing spins. So you actually have to grab onto this middle piece. I'm using an adjustable wrench. Grab onto it like that, and then you can tighten down just the nut. So I double check the alignment one more time, make sure everything looks good to go before you release it. Now I'm going to throw my leveling spacer back on, and we're ready to put it back in the truck. So I'm going to throw the whole assembly in here. I'm just going to get one bolt in through the top. Now looking down here, we got quite a bit of work to do to get the two holes to line up to slide the bolt through, so that's where our pry bar comes in handy. Slide it in like this, pull it down. You can see it gives us that leverage to get our bolt in there. Strictly for the ease of it, I'm going to push the bolt in through the front, not through the back. Awesome. So with this bolt here, we don't want to torque it yet. We want to make sure it's tight, obviously. But we'll actually wait to torque it until the truck is back on the ground. We have the convenience of this being a truck, so we have the ground clearance to get under here. But because the bushings are rubber, when the truck settles, the bushing will tweak a little bit, and if it's torqued before then it'll substantially reduce the life of the bushing. Whereas if you wait until it's in its final resting position, basically, and then you torque it down, it'll last much longer. Next, I'm going to attach to the 4 bolts for the lower ball joint down on the bottom. Okay, just finishing tightening up the top 3 bolts here, and then we'll reconnect the sway bar end link. So I was taking a little closer inspection, and this is pretty loose. And I had remembered that I actually did the passenger side a couple years ago, and I never did the driver's side. So I actually have a replacement one that I'm going to be throwing in. It's from a very reputable brand. Don't worry, it's not the lower ball joints, but yeah, we'll just throw that in and then we'll reconnect it. Now that we've got everything else back together, we can lower this back down, put the wheel back on, set it back on the ground, and tighten that lower shock mount, and then we're done with the fronts. Okay guys, home stretch, last corner, stick with me here. I got good news and bad news for you. Good news, only 2 bolts left. Bad news, one of them might make you regret doing the whole job. Fortunately, my truck is completely rust free and it's still a little difficult, but if your truck has any amount of rust on it, there's videos on YouTube of people torching it, people grinding it, which there's literally no room. I don't know how they do that, but yeah, so maybe I just jinxed it. Maybe this nut is gonna spin on me, but yeah, rear end a little bit easier than the front end. Well, actually a lot easier, minus the top nut here, but it's really legitimately 2 bolts. One on the bottom pops right out, super easy, and then the top one, once you can get it out, slides right back in, and then tightening it down is kind of the doozy, but yeah, let's just get to it. Okay, so quick note on jacking the truck up in the rear. Originally I had done it from the diff and then supported it on both sides on the axle, and then I realized to get the shock out you need to let the axle droop. So yeah, I changed plan a little bit. I just have it supported up here at the back of the frame, and then that way it's at full droop right now. It's really low, but it's at full droop, and then the shock just slides right out. No issues at all. So yeah, now we'll just take off the lower bolt. It's a 17 millimeter. Okay, the top of the shock mounts on top of the frame here, up, sandwiched between the bottom of the bed and some of this framing. So on mine, it's a 14 millimeter nut that you can pull off, and super conveniently on, I think these are OEM, I can only imagine, this shock body here is actually connected to that inner threaded rod. So you can hold it here and then loosen the nut off. Like, you don't have to have an Allen key on top or something. So that makes removal super easy. Unfortunately, the Bilsteins aren't that way when we go to put them in a second. Okay, so there's a lot of washers and bushings that we got to set up on the shock before we can mount it. So it starts with one of the large ones face up. Then we'll do a bushing. Then the small one face down on top of the bushing. And then that's what we'll push up into the frame. Then on top of the frame, we'll do a bushing. And then the other large flat one. Now, in the instructions, it specifically says to check the orientation of the picture, and the picture has it facing up like this. It would make sense to have it down so it's sitting on top of the washer like that, but the instructions say to have it up with the nut on top like this, so that's what we're going to be doing. Kind of a tight squeeze for this guy in here, so I'm just going to tap it in with a rubber mallet. This freaking e-brake cable right in the way. So this is on the passenger side. You can see I have the vice grips on the top squared off part of the shock, and then I have my ratcheting wrench on the nut, and that way I'm able to spin it without spinning the whole assembly here. This was a huge pain in the butt, and it would be more of a pain of the butt if I didn't have this ratcheting wrench, so I definitely appreciate having this. Got it all mounted up. It's all set up there. I'll wait to torque this down until it gets on the ground, but we can jack up the diff again, get this stand out of here, and get the wheel back on, and we are done. Okay, awesome. Well, I'm so happy to have that done. It's been on the to-do list for quite a while now, but I really wouldn't say that it's a huge job, especially if you're just doing the new shocks there. If you start going down the rabbit hole of ball joints and axles and tie rod ends and stuff like that, then it can definitely grow into a much bigger project, which might not be the biggest deal if while you're in there, right? But for me, I just wanted to get the shocks done today, and I'm really happy with how it went. It took me, give or take, 8 hours for all four, but that's with filming. I took a little dinner break, and filming always eats up so much time. So I'd call probably like 5 hours for the project. But yeah, I'd say take it on if you're willing to get dirty and do some work yourself. But I would take a look at those rear shock mounts before you start doing anything back there, because I could see that turning into a really frustrating night if you're trying to get those out and they're all rusted in there. But yeah, I'm gonna drive the truck around for a few days, and then next week I'll have a video out on why I decided to go with the 4600s. I know a bunch of you are gonna be wondering, why didn't you go with the 5100s? And like I said, I'll talk about it in that video, but really it comes down to money and what I'm gonna use it for. And these just made more sense to me. But again, all that will be coming. And in that video, I'll also be doing an update of my thoughts on these and how well it improved the truck. So stay tuned for that. But otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing, and have a great rest of your day.